Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus with kind of a breakdown of a deck tech as well as some short sideboarding guide on this a little bit unusual build of Boros Burn here for the month of April. Kind of go through the main deck, the sideboard, why I've kind of decided on the particular configurations that I have for this month. I'll give you a quick sideboard guide on probably the top 8, 9, 10 matchups in the format and kind of go from there. As a friendly reminder, if you like what you're seeing on the channel, especially Burn and Jund content, please consider subscribing, giving us the thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. So what is this build trying to accomplish? What are some of the specifics? Why are we doing some of the specific things that we're doing? For starters, land base. Doesn't seem like a whole lot. The main debate is, do you run 19 lands? Do you run 20 lands? How many Sunbaked Canyon / Fiery Islet builds do you run, etc.? A lot of the default has kind of become these kind of 12 lands, 13 lands right here are kind of the core of every burn base. 4 Inspiring Vantage, 3 Mountain, 2 Sacred Foundry, 4 Sunbaked Canyon. Those are kind of the undisputed, core of the Boros Burn land base. How many other canopy lands, particularly Fire Islet, you run, kind of depends on how much damage you want to take. And then the fetch lands. The fetch lands, between Bloodstained Mire, Wooded Foothills, Arid Mesa, and Scalding Tarn, it really doesn't particularly matter. Bloodstained Mire Pass can give the impression that you're Jund. Scalding Tarn can give the impression that you're like a blue control deck, especially if you don't have any other plays on one. So it can kind of misinform your opponent a little bit, but in general the fetch lands aren't really there other than, are we running 5 or are we running 6? So the main reason why only one Fiery Islet over 2, kind of a small thing, is reasons we'll get into a little bit later. I'm only running 2 copies of Lightning Helix. So we don't have as much ability to gain life to offset the life we're losing from our fetch lands, our Sunbaked Canyons, our Fiery Islets, our Eidolons of the Rebel. So I'm only running 5, and also the ability to cast specifically Core Firewalker out of the sideboard kind of changes the math. As far as our 1-mana spells, we usually have about a 97% chance of casting our spells with 16 white sources, and then it goes down to 95%. So it's not a huge amount in terms of being able to cast Helix or Boros Charm on time in the main deck. But the difference between Core Firewalker being able to be cast onto and not when you're running 2 Fiery Islets and a 20 land count is 77% to 72%. So it is kind of a noticeable dip. So kind of the core reason of why we're running the land base we're running. As far as the main thing, obviously, kind of the core of the burn deck is these 16 spells, 4 copies of Eidolon, and 4 copies of Boros Charm. And then the other spells, Searing Blaze, Skull Crack, Lightning Helix, Skewer, and Riftbolt, are kind of the ones that get debated in terms of, which of these cards do you use to fill out your main deck. Some people just completely eschew, put the 2 copies of Skullcrack in the sideboard, just run 4 copies of Skullcrack, and then run the 4 Lightning Helixes in the main. I think Lightning Helix, it's good for what it does, but much like Searing Blaze and Eidolon, there are some spots where it's not quite as good. Not to the same level as Blaze and Eidolon, but to me, Helix is necessary as a 4-of in a more aggressive meta, in a meta where you're trying to run 6 canopy lands. I don't think the meta is there. Now, keeping in mind, I'm keeping in general of the Magic Online meta, not your local meta whenever Paper Magic starts back up or any of that kind of stuff. So for now, that's why I'm eschewing the 2 copies of Lightning Helixes. And while I could certainly put all 4 Skullcracks in the sideboard, I think, as we'll get into some of the matchups, it's worthwhile to have some Skullcracks in the main. And it kind of frees up some slots for a little bit of a weird sideboard plan that I'm going to be trying out with Burn moving forward. That obviously it's not standard tech, but since I've been giving it some thought, it's kind of how I want to approach things. Rest of the main deck, kind of your standard Thoroughfare, Searing Blazes, Eidolons, etc. But that's kind of the main reason why the main deck is the way it is. The sideboard, I kind of went through and took each one of like the top 10, top 12 matchups and did a rough sideboarding guide. I was talking all the way through it, but the video wasn't recording, and I'm not going back and covering 35 minutes of trying to go through step by step by step, trying to recreate my thought process with this list. I will do that briefly when I'm discussing boarding in and boarding out, but basically it comes down to what cards do you want in certain matchups. There are other things you can consider in the sideboard. You can consider things like something like Tunnel Ingus, which is primarily tech for the Dryad of Elysian Groves Primeval Titan decks. So if those are big in your meta, you obviously want to consider including those. I've previously included cards like Exquisite Firecraft in my 75 to be able to play against the controlling decks, but the problem with the current blue control decks is a lot of them you want to be leaving in some number of Searing Blazes to hit some early creatures like Emery, Icefang, Coatl, Gilded Goose. So we don't have as many slots of stuff to bring in, hence why I'm kind of like not including Exquisite Firecraft. Besides, those decks tend to have a lot of incidental life gain, so the 4 uncounterable spell isn't always enough to get there, and as well as Death Shadow is not a huge part of the meta. Other cards you consider is more copies of Smash, more copies of Path, Deflecting Palm, etc. I'm not a huge fan of Deflecting Palm in this current meta. There are some creatures with some big things like, Eldrazi Tron and such you can consider bringing in, but I'm not a huge fan of that game plan. I was a huge proponent of Deflecting Palm for a couple of years, and then I kind of did the 180 where I'm one of its biggest detractors. Some people bring in things like, especially in a bigger mana meta, could bring in things like Molten Rain or Pillage or Boil against these red decks. I don't think Burn consistently runs enough lands to pull something off like Boil, and I think it's entirely too narrow, and the game could possibly have already gotten away from you at that point by the time you hit your 4th land drop. Other cards I've seen run, things like Flames of the Bloodhand, Rampaging Frostodon. I think those cards are too narrow, and I think especially Frostodon's just too slow for creatures. Other cards you consider, things like Wear Tear. So the only time I bring in Wear Tear specifically is against Bogles and Leyline of Sanctity. You can mitigate Blood Moon by boarding out your white cards. You can mitigate a lot of other things. Those are the 2 particular cards you consider the card Wear Tear against. Bogle's not currently a huge part of the meta. It's not really positioned against a lot of the good decks that are doing well right now. Anyway, it's bad against the control decks. It's bad against regular Tron. It's bad against Chalice and 1 from Eldrazi Tron. Not great against Jund. It's not particularly well positioned right now. Leyline of Sanctity, I now have a sideboard package that includes enough creatures that I don't think Leyline's a big deal. And the decks that are usually bringing in Leyline against us ad nauseum, and the Neo brand decks are enough of a kind of risk-reward thing that I don't think it's worth specifically having that card in the sideboard. Beyond that, everything else is kind of a 2 other than Rest in Peace. It's mainly because of the board-in, board-out numbers. Obviously, Searing Blood, cards for the smaller creature decks. You could potentially bring it in the mirror, but it's more for decks like Humans and Merfolk and the random mana dorks that you'll see out of like Midrange and such. Smash the Smithereens, 2 of's fine. Gives you outs to Chalice, it gives you outs to Stoneforge Mystic packages, etc. Gives you outs to things like Chalice without going too overboard on bringing this card in on blank. 2 Skullcracks to supplement the 2 in the main deck against all the incidental life gain out of especially Uro decks, as well as Klothys and some Thragtuster being main decked by regular Tron. Path to Exile gives you some outs against some bigger creatures. Core Firewalker, this is specifically because of the red mirrors, against Burn, against the Prowess decks, and then 3 copies of Rest in Peace. I pretty much never leave home without this. It's good against Dredge, gives you enough of a reach against Dredge, and then while not being too overboard, and also gives you some incidental things against like Storm and such. And some people just like having Rest in Pieces against things like Snowblade and Jund. I'm not a proponent for that strategy, but I generally include 2 or 3 copies of Rest in Peace. Then we get to Soulscar Mage. So Soulscar Mage is a bit of a bizarre one. I have not tested this card out yet. The thought process behind Soulscar Mage is I wanted a card that can answer big creatures, that can come in matchups where my opponent is going to have like something like Leyline of Sanctity, or in matchups where having additional 1-drop creatures on the play is a huge advantage. So a lot of people have done that by, okay, do I bring in an additional Path to Exile? Do I bring in another Core Firewalker? I honestly think the answer to all of those questions might be Soulscar Mage. So the big issue with a deck like Bant Snowblade or Urza is a lot of those decks don't have a ton of spot removal. They have early counter spells, but they only have like Coatls or Path to Exiles or maybe a couple of Galv Blasts. So getting on the board early is often how we get ahead against them, and having another threat that, yes, while it doesn't have haste, it does have a static ability that is relevant against things like Tarmogoyfs or Glorybringers, or a bunch of cards that otherwise we would need Path to Exile to answer. So I think this is purely theoretical. I have not tested this in the sideboard yet, but I think having additional cards to sideboard in, especially on the play, gives us better utility against certain decks that we need to run down. Like killing the Bant Snowblade decks, like killing Tron before they get online. Like having a way to shrink the creatures out of Eldrazi Tron, making our burn spells a little bit more relevant. Shrinking our opponent's Tarmogoyfs out of Jund. I think being able to play to the board in those matchups a little bit more, especially on the play when we can leverage our creatures better, and we're not forced to take a little bit more of the controlling role in certain those matchups. I'm going to try Soulscar Mage. That's what we're going to see in the next league or two. We'll see how it fits in. So that's kind of my crazy reason how we got to this sideboard. But as far as the specific matchups, we should start getting into that now. Alright, first up we are starting with Bant Snow Control. This is the deck based around Uro and the card Arkham's Astrolabe, as well as things like Icefang Coatl and such. For that matchup, you're playing against basically a blue-white control deck that's including Icefang Coatl and Uro. To that end, you're going to want to board out some of your Searing Blazes. Not all, because you do want to be able to hit Icefang Coatl and such for some value. Cards you would want to consider bringing in are your 2 copies of Skullcrack, and it's pretty much about it. So it's a fairly easy swap, 2 copies of Skullcrack for 2 copies of Searing Blaze. On the play, however, I would strongly consider like cutting some amount of maybe your Lightning Helixes or some other inefficient burn spell and bringing in the 2 copies of Soulscar Mage. So in general, especially on the draw, you're going to be boarding out 2 copies of Searing Blaze for 2 copies of Skullcrack. Not really worthwhile bringing in any of these other cards. Some people would consider Rest in Peace. Some people would consider Path to Exile. I would consider boarding in the 2 copies of Skullcrack. Potentially 2 Soulscar Mages. I think, especially on the play, is a lot better. So on the draw, I would cut 2 Skullcracks for 2 Searing Blazes. On the play, I'd cut 2 Soulscar Mages and 2 Skullcracks for like 2 Rift Bolts and 2 copies of Searing Blaze, or potentially 2 copies of Skewer the Critics. Rift Bolt was generally my default cut against decks that are playing Teferi Time Raveler, hence why I would strongly suggest cutting these 4 for bringing in copies of Skullcrack and Soulscar Mage, especially on the play. The next matchup we're going to be talking about is the Temur Urza decks that have been popularizing lately. These are kind of the spiritual successors to the Oko Urza decks that used to be dominating Modern for some period of time before the Oko bannings and Mox Opal bannings. They're a little bit slower than they used to be, but they're a lot of the same thing. Gilded Goose, Emery, and Urza with a pile of counterspells and a pile of cantripping artifacts, along with things like Engineered Explosives and Galv Blast to interact with your opponent. They're packing a good amount of counterspells in them, usually Metallic Rebuke and Cryptic Command. They're a little bit more creature heavy, a little bit more life gain heavy, which can make them a little bit trickier than even the Bant Snow Cousins. Things like Gilded Goose and Uro can gain them life in the main deck, and they frequently have things like Ether, Gust in the sideboard to counteract some of what we're doing, slow us down a little bit for them to set up their engine. To that end, the main card we're interested in cutting is some amount of Searing Blaze, and other cards you can also consider cutting are Lightning Helixes and such. It's not generally a racing matchup. You could also cut Rift Bolts or Skewer the Critics, whatever your preferred thing. For this particular guide, I'm going to advocate cutting Lightning Helixes and 2 copies of Searing Blaze to bring in 2 copies of Path to Exile and 2 copies of Skullcrack. Skullcrack, kind of self-explanatory. They have some life gain in their deck. You want to be bringing in your copies of Skullcrack. Path to Exile, just Uro alone I don't think is enough to bring in Path to Exile, but when you combine that with Urza, which is kind of their entire engine of their deck, you generally want answers to that. Another card you can bring in, especially on the play, is the 2 copies of Soulscar Mage. Once again, this is kind of the new plan I'm advocating with particular build a burn. For that end, you can cut either Rift Bolts or Skewer the Critics on that one. Obviously, it gets a little bit worse the more spells you're cutting, so something to keep in mind whenever you're doing that. You generally want to leave an Eidolon, especially in this matchup, because they have a bunch of cantripping artifacts that really punishes them when Eidolon's in play. And sometimes when they don't have answers, they have to run those spells out to be able to gain enough traction to find the answers of what they're looking for. So that is what I would advocate. These 4 cards on the play for these 4 cards, and then you can cut some number of either Skewer the Critics or Rift Bolts to bring in your Soulscar Mages and have even more creatures to leverage to pressure them in the early turns and when they're trying to set up their Emeries and such, and being a little bit slower to the board than some of the other decks that we face off against. Hence why I advocate this Soulscar Mage plan. Next up, we have Red-Green Midrange, which is kind of the new spiritual successor to the old Red-Green Ponza decks. Their big new thing has been Klothys, which obviously is an enormous pain in the hind end for our deck to deal with because we generally don't have the ability to interact with it, even with Path to Exiles, and they're also running Magus of the Moon over Blood Moon. Hence, part of the reason why I don't advocate Wear Tear, because Blood Moon was certainly a card you could consider Wear Tear for. But in terms of their deck, they do have some incidental life gain. They do also have the ability to Blood Moon you sometimes. So for that reason, I would advocate boarding out the 4 copies of Boros Charm as your starting point for sideboarding. Boros Charm does not deal with any of their creatures. This is a board-centric matchup that they can certainly race us in some spots, and also going down on some white cards and reducing your dependency upon white cards in the matchup is certainly preferred. As far as cards you want to bring in the 2 copies of Path to Exile and the 2 copies of Skullcrack first and foremost. Path to Exile allows you to deal with their bigger threats, so things like Glorybringer and Obstinate Baloth that might be coming out of the sideboard that often your 3 damage spells can't always deal with quite handily. And then Skullcracks give you some outs to their Klothys, Obstinate Baloths. They happen to be playing things like Weather the Storm or Dragon's Claw to deal with the matchup as well. Beyond that, I would not advocate bringing in Soulscar Mage necessarily in the matchup. One thing to keep an eye out for is, do you see copies of something like a Braid coming in from the sideboard? Oftentimes they have Bone Crusher Giant and Lightning Bolt, which are already pretty good answers to Soulscar Mage, especially in the draw. So I would only advocate boarding out these 4 cards for these 4 cards. The Soulscar Mage plan I'm generally implementing against decks that don't feature a ton of spot removal and where we might need to be able to get on the board a little bit faster and try to cut down our clock a little bit more. So things like Tron, things like the control decks that only have like Path to Exile. Do not advocate this plan against things like Jund, against this red-green mid-range deck that can answer it with things like Glorybringer, Chandra, Lightning Bolt, Braids, and Bone Crusher Giants. So generally, the less spot removal and such your opponents have, the more I will be advocating this, trying out this Soulscar Mage plan. Next up is Mono Green Tron, which obviously noted for the Urza Tron lands and trying to play big bombs on by turn 3. Payoffs in this matchup for them are things like Thragtusk, Wormcoil Engine. Karn Liberated and such isn't as effective against us, but can be relevant in some spots. But the 2 cards we are most afraid of are Wormcoil Engine and Thragtusk. To that end, you want your anti-life gain measures and abilities to get those off the board. On the play, I advocate boarding out 4 copies of Searing Blaze and 2 copies of Lightning Helix. On the draw, I will get into that in a second. I usually advocate boarding out some number of Eidolons. They're not as good because your opponent won't be cantripping as much or casting like their Sylvan Scryings or their eggs quite as much on those turns. Oftentimes they can cycle through those before you have a chance to play your Eidolon. But for that, you're bringing in 2 Smash, 2 Skullcrack, and 2 Soulscar Mage. Once again, I'm advocating Soulscar Mage. It gives you a pseudo-answer to Wormcoil Engine, allowing your burn spells to kind of reduce the size of the Wormcoil Engines. Obviously, your Skullcracks and your Smashes are coming in regardless. As far as on the draw, Soulscar Mage feels a little bit too slow in that experience, and you want to bring in your answers to their big boys, especially particularly Wormcoil Engine. Being able to get this off the board for 1 mana is very nice, especially when you're a little bit behind, which sometimes you can be on the draw. And then instead of cutting Lightning Helixes, I recommend cutting Eidolons of the Great Revel. Going down a little bit on creatures in that particular spot. Eidolon, once, as I've already mentioned, isn't as good once they've already cycled some of their eggs, and they've already kind of set up Tron, and they're just more worried about setting up their payoffs. There's certainly some spots where Eidolon can be good, even on the draw, when like they have Tron, and like say you path their first guy. So leaving in like 1 or 2 copies of Eidolon is fine. So on the play, leave Eidolon in, on the draw, board it out. Next up, we have Eldrazi Tron, which is much like its older, bigger brother of Green Tron. You're boarding out some number of Searing Blazes, both on the play and on the draw. There are some targets in the deck, like they have Walking Ballistas, they have Matter Shapers, but generally that's not positive value for doing that. 4 Searing Blazes are going out whether you're on the play or on the draw. Cards you definitely want to consider bringing in are the 2 copies of Smash to Smithereens, as well as the 2 copies of Path to Exile. Path to Exile clears their bigger guys out of the way, buys you some time. Smash to Smithereens, pretty good against specifically Chalice, also has some hedge scenarios if they have something like Basilisk Color or Wormcoil Engine they're bringing in against you, either from Karn, it's wishing for it, or having it in their sideboard, period. On the play, you want to be bringing in your Soulscar Mages. You're better able to leverage its abilities to pressure them. In that particular case, you can board out either Lightning Helixes or copies of Skewer the Critics or Riftbolt. I don't advocate cutting any of your 1-mana spells, even though Chalice obviously on 1 can be an enormous pain in the butt. Lightning Helix can help you race a little bit, so I would probably cut 2 copies of either Skewer the Critics or Riftbolt. As to which one is better, I'm not honestly sure. I would probably maybe cut 1 and 1, cut 2 of 1, 2 of the other, get a better idea of how you feel about that. Riftbolt has the weakness of it can get locked out on Chalice for 3. Skewer has the weakness of your when you're not able to leverage your creatures is better, but obviously when you're on the play, you obviously want that. So I would probably advocate actually cutting 2 copies of Riftbolt and kind of going like this, or you could even cut better yet, 2 copies of Boros Charm. This card doesn't interact with creatures at all, so cut these 6 when you're on the play to bring in the 2 Soulscar Mages. If you happen to see either copies of Wormcoil Engine or copies of Basilisk Color, I would strongly consider bringing in the Skullcracks, but the 2 in the main are fine enough of a hedge without necessarily over sideboarding. So in those situations, I would, especially on the draw, I would just board out the 4 copies of Searing Blaze for 2 copies of Smash and 2 copies of Path to Exile. In the Burn Mirror, the cards that most people cut versus what I cut are a little bit different. In the Burn Mirror, the cards you definitely want are 2 copies of Path to Exile and 2 copies of Core Firewalker. And you might also consider bringing in the copies of Skullcrack. So Path to Exile answers opposing Core Firewalkers, also in a pinch can answer some of the other threats in the deck, as it often comes down to answering your opponent's creatures first, then trying to burn them out. Skullcrack, obviously, that one kind of depends on how much life gain they have, but when you're facing down Core Firewalkers and Lightning Helixes, you generally want to bring in your anti-life gain stuff. So these are the 6 cards you generally want to board in. As far as the cards you board out, generally on the draw, I will board out 4 copies of Eidolon, and I will also consider boarding out 2 copies of Skewer the Critics, specifically because, while they do answer creatures quite nicely, Sometimes you can have a harder time triggering Skewer the Critics when you're trying to aim a lot of your burn spells at your opponent's creatures, and your own creatures aren't specifically sticking around a lot. On the play, I will often leave in 2 Eidolons, and then maybe cut like 2 Boros Charms or the other 2 copies of Skewer the Critics. Eidolon, oftentimes I won't board any back in. I just don't like the Eidolon in these hefty racing situations, but a lot of people will advocate boarding in, boarding out. Some number of Eidolons in the play versus a draw. I advocate leaving all 4 out and then boarding 2 Skewer the Critics and boarding these 6 in, play or draw regardless. Once again, you're not bringing in the Soulscar Mage play in this matchup because there's a lot of bolts flying around. They're generally able to answer creatures pretty efficiently. And you're not really gaining any leverage from having a 1-drop creature a lot of times, especially one without haste in this particular matchup. So I would board out 4 Eidolon, 2 Skewer the Critics for 2 Skullcrack, 2 Core Firewalker, 2 Path to Exile, and heaven knows if you have more Paths or more Core Firewalkers, board those in as well. Next we are on to Jund. Jund's a little bit of a weird outlier because they have a lot of removal spells and a lot of creatures. But once again, kind of the card that is the weakest in this matchup is the 4 copies of Searing Blaze. Whether you're on the play or on the draw, the only one this reliably hits is like Bloodbraid Elf, and by that point, you can already have a Karmagloyf or a Kroxa down beating you down. So you generally want to board these 4 out. The cards you want to bring in against them are usually 2 copies of Path to Exile and 2 copies of Skullcrack. Path is not ideal in the matchup because a lot of times they can nab it with a discard spell. They can take up Liliana until you get rid of it. But it does usually buys you a lot of time answering the first Tarmogoyf, answering the first Kroxa. So these are the 4 cards you want to board in for these particular 4 cards. Beyond that, you don't want to bring in the Soulscar Mage play in. Once again, there are decks with Lightning Bolts, Fatal Pushes, Assassin's Trophies, Liliana Edicts, so bringing in the additional creatures is not particularly good in this matchup as well. The final matchup we'll be covering in this deck tech and sideboard guide is Dredge. One of, if not my least favorite matchups to play against, and also one of the matchups why I continue to have 3 copies of Rest in Peace in my sideboard. The first card you look to board out in this matchup is 4 copies of Boros Charm. This card does not interact with their creatures, and it does not prevent life gain. So these are the cards you look to the most for boarding out. As far as the cards you want to board in, the first cards you want to board in are the 3 copies of Rest in Peace and the 2 copies of Skullcrack to help mitigate any type of life gain they might get from Creeping Chill. Also, if they're really hating burn and they play something like Life Goes On, Not to the Bone, gives you even more outs in those situations. Other cards you can consider bringing in, Path to Exile is a little narrow. Searing Blood is okay in some spots where you're like trying to race their creatures, but a lot of them have kind of recursive threats, so that's not quite as good. The final card that I would advocate cutting is a copy of Eidolon the Great Revel. It can certainly be okay in some spots, but there's a lot of spots where Eidolon is not particularly good. You want to leave in your Lightning Helixes because this is very much a reaching matchup. So I would advocate cutting these 5 cards for these 5. And if you want to bring in copies of Searing Blood, I would recommend cutting additional copies of Eidolon of the Great Revel, as it's not great in the matchup, but it is serviceable in some spots, especially against these slower builds of Dredge that aren't able to leverage, obviously Faithless Looting being banned, and some of these ones aren't running the full 4 copies of Merchant of the Veil, so there's a lot less turn 1 discard outlets. They usually have like Shriek Horns they can play on 1, so Eidolon is okay, especially when they're on the lone plan, but it's not great in the matchup, especially if you want to bring in Searing Blood. Keeping in mind that Searing Blood triggers when the creature dies, so it is a bit of a nombo with Rest in Peace, hence why I kind of recommend these 5 in, these 5 out, but if you do want additional creature removal, by all means bring the Searing Bloods in. So I hope this detailed deck, tech, and kind of a quick sideboard guide kind of gives you guys some idea of how to approach certain matchups, how I think about building the deck right now. The deck, there's so many different like small nuances with Burn. Like most of the core is pretty set in stone, and obviously you can run a sideboard without Path to Exiles. You can run a sideboard without Rest in Pieces, without Core Firewalkers. etc. A lot of it is what do you want to be. I kind of built this deck to try to have a balanced approach to the top 10 decks, top 8, 10 decks in the meta, and having a bit of a sideboard plan for some of these more difficult, or have become more difficult matchups, like the Bant Snow decks, like Tron, etc. Having a little bit of ways to bring in some extra creatures to leverage against decks with Leyline of Sanctity. So I'm not set on the Soulscar Mage plan. This could something that could increase over time to like the full 4 of. This is something that could be completely a waste of time. But I think the reasoning behind it, the logic behind it is sound enough that it's something worthwhile trying, especially on the play against some of these decks that have like some answers but not a ton. But once again, you don't want to be bringing that plan in against decks like if your deck's full of, or if your meta is full of things like Ponza or the Gruul Monsters, not Ponza, Jund, etc. Decks that have a ton of spot removal, you don't want to be bringing in additional creature threats in those situations usually. But I think this is a very well-balanced version of Burn that should be able to do pretty decently in the meta, and we'll certainly be running it through some leagues in the coming weeks to see if Soulscar Mage tech works out before. But with Ikora coming out, and like there was that one hybrid black-white companion, a lot of people were talking about that going in Burn. One sideboard slot, I can see it being decent. We'll see how that goes, being able to bring back Goblin Guides and Monster Swiftbeers and Eidolons. Obviously gives us a little bit more reach. That will cause the sideboards to get retooled a little bit. We'll certainly explore that card when it comes out. But beyond that, I hope this sideboard guide and kind of explanation for a deck tech is helpful to you all out there. And if you all like this video format, give it a thumbs up and let me know what you think down in the comments about this type of a deck tech and short sideboard guide.